I didn't realize I ran a red light. And I got out of the car, walked back to their car. My feelings were that what I had done was going to cause me to go to death row. So when the officer turned away from me, I shot both officers.
4 teens were naked on the Lovers Lane in El Segundo on July 22nd, 1957. They ran around asking for help, shocked by what had happened. A short distance away, 28-year-old Officer Phillips and 27-year-old Officer Curtis were doing their regular patrolling near the traffic light when they saw a case of rash driving. 2 other officers passed by and asked if everything was okay, and the patrolling officers waved to them to let them know it was. The next thing they knew, gunshots had killed both officers. Was there a link between these strange crimes? What were the motives behind these strange crimes? Let's find out. Los Angeles County is home to El Segundo. Cali for El Segundo feels like a small town because it has a cute downtown area and lots of parks and green places. Just a few miles away are the beaches of Manhattan and Hermosa, which makes the city a popular place for both locals and tourists. Despite these benefits, Los Angeles County has been named the most dangerous place in the United States for police officers, with almost 1 officer being shot while on duty every single day of the year. A special unit for crimes against police officers was created to go after people who hurt or kill police officers. This unit often deals with cases where 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 10 police officers are shot in a week. In 1957, a cruel police officer was killed in the small city of El Segundo in this county. The police force had trouble sleeping for almost 50 years. On the summer night of July 22nd, 1957, a group of 4 teenagers, including 17-year-old Bob Dewar, were driving down a well-known Lovers Lane in Hawthorne, California, after a party. The 2 boys, including Dewar, were looking for a safe place to hang out with their 2 female friends. Dewar decided to roll down a window and enjoy the warm air when a man appeared and pointed a gun at his face.
I saw the gun as the only thing that came through the window. That was my whole life in that millisecond.
The man demanded money from the teens and told them he wouldn't hurt them. The teens were scared and gave him their money, praying that he would keep his word. The man then threatened to kill them and made them take off their clothes. He then used surgical tape and a flashlight to tie up their hands and cover their eyes. One of the teens was also beaten, while the others lay helpless.
Well, I thought for sure that he would kill the girl because she probably had seen him, but I guess he was going to kill all of us. And we stood out there stark naked for like 3 or 4 minutes. We just expected to hear the gun start going on.
As they fell, they heard the door to their car close and the sound of the car driving off. The man had stolen their car, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere, naked and vulnerable. 2 police officers, Richard Phillips, 28 years old, and Milton Curtis, 27 years old, were on patrol when they saw a car run a red light. They pulled over and asked the driver to get out. While they were doing this, another police car came by and offered to help, but Richard and Milton told the driver that everything was fine.
The car had not been reported stolen at that time, therefore it was not in the system. So there was no way for those officers to have known that was a stolen vehicle or it had just been used in that crime.
Suddenly, the driver pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and shot both officers 3 times. Officer Phillips was hurt badly, but he was able to shoot back 3 times before asking for help on the radio. Sadly, both officers died at the scene of the crime.
He's like, what are they doing here? And it was pretty much like, he's sleeping, but why doesn't he come home and sleep? And she says he's in heaven.
As soon as word got out that Officers Phillips and Curtis had been brutally killed, the police were on high alert. Every lead was followed, and every bystander was questioned, but the case seemed to be at a standstill. That is, until the 4 terrified teens who had been robbed and beaten up showed up at the scene and gave the police important information that linked their case to the killings of the officers. The car. Within minutes, the police found the abandoned 1949 Ford sedan with the card bullet holes made by Officer Phillips shooting at the attacker. They also took fingerprints from the teens' clothes in the car, but it didn't lead anywhere.
When they called me that there had been 2 policemen shot and killed, so I knew the importance of the situation. If there was any evidence that I could get, I'd have to get it.
The cops had no other leads to follow, so they were at a loss. The media were all over the story, getting the word out everywhere. As the days turned into weeks, the tension rose, but the case was not moving forward. In 1958, True Detective magazine wrote about the murders and asked the public for help. All leads that came in from the article were checked, but nothing was found. The investigation into the murders of the 2 police officers and the theft of the teens' cash had reached a dead end. But 2 years later, in 1960, a resident of Manhattan Beach made a shocking discovery. 2 watches and a revolver were found buried in his backyard. The watches belonged to the teens whose cash were taken by the criminal.
Went out his backyard and found the chamber to a handgun and thought, well, maybe it had something to do with the frame he found a year prior. So he went in his garage, looked at it, put it together, and found that it was a match.
The police did ballistics tests on the gun and found that it was the same one used to kill the police officers. However, they couldn't figure out who owned the gun or who the killer was, even though they were able to track down the serial number. The trail seemed to have gone cold again. It wasn't until later that investigators found out that the gun had been bought 4 days before the murders at a Sears store in Shreveport, Louisiana, under the name G.D. Wilson, with a fake address in Miami, Florida.
The person who sold that gun, he told him that he believed the man was from out of town, and his accent didn't sound like a Louisiana accent. It sounded more southern than that.
At the YMCA near Sears, someone signed in with the name George D. Wilson, saying they were from Miami and giving the same fake address.
We actually went into the room where this George Wilson had checked in, and from this window of this room, you could see the Sears store. And it was just kind of, for us, it was kind of overwhelming being in there and seeing that and trying to figure out what was going on in this man's mind when he was there.
The cops had a lead, but it didn't lead anywhere. They found every George D. Wilson in the Miami area, but none of them was the killer. The case was never solved, and the killer was still out there, haunting the memories of those who knew what happened that night. Eventually, the case went cold again because there were no new clues or leads.
But then over a period of time, too, it was like nothing was being solved, nothing was coming up, everything went cold.
In 2002, police in El Segundo got a disturbing tip from a woman who said her uncle had bragging about killing 2 police officers. When they looked into it further, they found that her uncle's fingerprints had been compared to those found in the getaway car in the late 1950s, but it didn't help. This tip brought the case back to people's attention, and it was decided that the original prints would be re-examined using the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or IAFIS.
Sometimes there's areas that are not clear. They could be smudged. There could be artifacts in there that are not clear. So the computer may count that or read that as a particular characteristic.
The prints were put into the system, and after some time, it showed that they were a match for a man called Gerald Fitton Mason.
We stood hovering over his computer screen, looking at all the ridge structure and the information there, and everything coincided. My words were, "Oh my God."
The police were confused because this man's name was never brought up during the investigation. Gerald Fitton. Mason was born in South Carolina on January 31st, 1934. He has a difficult past. After a short time in the Army, he got into trouble with the law right away and was arrested for breaking into homes and stealing in the 1950s. He only served 8 months of his 3-year sentence before being released, and it wasn't long after that he was involved in the events in El Segundo. After that, Mason settled down and married Betty in 1960. They had 2 daughters who would later give him 3 grandchildren, and he seemed to have a normal life as the owner of a successful gas station and convenience store in the Columbia area. Investigators had been working hard to solve the case, and they finally had their lead signatures from the YMCA register and Sears store receipts that matched Mason's current handwriting samples. But they still needed more proof to make a strong case.
Now we've got a real suspect, but we were still a little bit apprehensive. Okay, it's a fingerprint, it's an old fingerprint. What else do we have?
Then they found 3 people who could still identify Mason. 2 police officers who weren't working the night of the murder, as well as a news reporter who was at the scene of the crime who remembered that Mason had asked him for a ride home near the crime scene on January 29th, 2003. When the investigators knocked on Mason's door, he opened it and told them they were from El Segundo and were homicide detectives. When they confronted Mason, he stuttered and said he thought he needed a lawyer to buy himself some time, but the detectives were persistent and told him they were there to arrest him for the murder of 2 police officers more than 45 years ago. Mason gasped in shock and said he couldn't believe they were bothering him with something that happened so many years ago while trying to avoid responsibility.
When we introduced ourselves and told him we were homicide investigators, he was a little bit irritated, and it was almost like, "You're here for that? That happened so long ago. I can't believe you're here bothering me with that, 45, 46 years later."
But the agents wouldn't give up. They arrested him and took him to the police station to question him. While they were looking through his body for evidence, they found a scar on the back of his right shoulder blade that reminded them of the 3rd bullet that came out of the gun of the late Officer Phillips.
Very last thing he did in life was to mark forever the man who killed him and his partner. And that's pretty compelling, because it's almost as if someone is speaking to you from the grave, telling you, "Ladies and gentlemen, I told you who it is. I pointed him out with my gunfire."
When questioned about the crimes, Mason gave a strange explanation. He said he bought the revolver only to protect himself from hitchhiking thieves. But why would someone who bought a revolver to protect themselves commit such horrible crimes? Maybe the gun made Mason more and more violent, but investigators soon found a strange collection of guns in his home, including another one of the same rare 9-shot 22 revolvers used in the murders. It was clear that Mason's reason for buying the guns was a desperate lie in these strange circumstances. 2 counts of murder were brought against Mason, along with charges of kidnapping, robbery, and attack. As the trial date got closer, Mason's family watched in despair as he agreed to a plea deal that dropped the charges of kidnapping, robbery, and assault on March 24, 2003. On the day of the deal, Mason looked tired and defeated. He knew he would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he didn't want to put his family through the pain of a full trial.
I didn't realize I ran a red light. And I got out of the car, walked back to their car. My feelings were that what I had done was going to cause me to go to death row. So when the officer turned away from me, I shot those officers.
The families of the police officers who were killed wept openly as he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. Mason's own family stood by in quiet, heartbroken over what had happened to their loved one.
It's impossible to express to so many people how sorry I am for the harm I inflicted that night. I do not understand why I did this. It is contrary to all I believe in. It does not fit in my life. It is not the person I know. I detest these crimes.
Mason was given 2 life sentences in prison and begged the court to forgive him. He continued, tears streaming down his face, that he didn't know why he did what he did, and begged them to forgive him and not be angry. He apologized heavily, saying he was so sorry for what he'd done, even though he was emotional. Officer Curtis's family wasn't touched. They thought Mason was only sorry because he was caught. Carolyn Officer Phillips's daughter had said that Mason's evil act had made her mother a widow and that it had destroyed their family's lives forever. She said that they could not and would not forgive him. Officer Milton Curtis's wife, Jean Curtis, said that her husband was her first love. She also said that they had a small argument the night of the murder and that she had always felt bad about it. She also said that they never got to say goodbye. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke. Officer Curtis and Officer Phillips's families finally got justice when the murderer was caught, tried, and given a life sentence. But the pain of their loss never went away, and they were left to put their broken lives back together. Jean Curtis was left with only memories of her beloved husband, and Officer Phillips's children had to grow up without a father.
What people would say about him being at 24 years old and committing these crimes and then living a life crime-free, it doesn't matter. He's a thief, he's a rape, a murderer. He just got old. That's all there is to it.
Thanks for joining me in exploring this chilling true crime story. If you found it as fascinating as I did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into real-life mysteries. Have any thoughts or theories about today's case? Share them in the comments below. I love hearing from you. And remember, stay curious, stay safe, and keep questioning the world around you.